This next segment is brought to you by Blue Cross and Blue Shield's National Labor Office. You know, Blue Cross and Blue Shield companies formed out of a need to provide affordable health care to teachers, to loggers, and miners. That was back in 1965, 60 years ago. That's when the Blues developed the National Labor Office to strengthen its commitment to organized labor. Well, today, Blue Cross and Blue Shield's National Labor Office remains focused on America's workers, advocating for affordable and equitable health care. Partnering with strategic alliances to provide industry-leading products and services, and proudly serving more than 18 million unionized workers, retirees, and their families, all working hard for America's working families and for the health of America. You can learn more by following them at Blue Labor on LinkedIn and X, formerly known as Twitter. And don't forget, you can check us out on Facebook or follow us on X, formerly known as Twitter. That would be AWF Union Podcast, AWF Union Podcast. Once again, we're taking a deep dive into history, and this is part of our segment. We started actually last year. It was called Labor 130. Now it's Labor 131. So it's 131 years since Grover Cleveland signed into law legislation creating the first Monday in September as Labor Day. So what we've been doing is checking in with various history professors, labor professors, to take a look at what happened in America during those 131 years. And joining us as our featured guest right now is Lauren Braun-Strumfels, and she is an associate professor of history at Cedar Crest College. She's the author of several books. One of them, Partners in Gatekeeping, How Italy Shaped U.S. Immigration Policy Over 10 Pivotal Years, 1891 to 1901. And she's also the author of several other books, which we'll probably get into on the podcast today. But this is going to be fun. Lauren, thanks for joining us here on America's Workforce. And I didn't realize until you came to the podcast that the Italians were pivotal when it comes to working class. Well, I mean, there's so many nationalities. I mean, I live in northeastern Ohio. We often call this a small Chicago because it's a melting pot of various personalities. And many parts of the Midwest are much like that. So thank you for joining us today. But maybe you can give us a little more information. I understand that you're also affiliated with the American Federation of Teachers. Well, let's start right there. I always like to know somebody's union background before we move on. So I'm turning it over to you. Go ahead.
Yeah, of course. So I'll mention that for 12 years, I taught at a community college in New Jersey where I was a proud member of AFT Local 2375. And before that, in grad school, I was part of our initial effort to organize a graduate employees organization, which is now part of a union chapter. So I've been involved in different campaigns. But one of the things that's really important to me, and sort of you mentioned that a little bit, is like how significant Italians are to the history of working class migration, to the rules that govern the freedom that we all have to move, whether we enjoy that freedom or we have barriers to move. And so I like to spotlight the history of Italians at the turn of the 20th century in particular, because I think it illuminates a lot of the debates that we're still having today about the freedom of people to work, to move, to find work, to leave when conditions are bad. And these are all issues, right, that we're still confronting.
So take me back to that time. We're going back more than 100 years here. And that was part of the big migration to the United States, which went on for decades. Yes. And it was in search of a better life. Let's be honest about that. So part of me wants to ask you, what was going on in Italy that made people say, hey, we got to get out of here. We got to come over to the U.S.
Exactly. Yeah. So Italian migration at the height was primarily an economic migration, like you're talking about. But there were elements of political suppression there as well. So when I talk about the height of Italian migration, the numbers are measured in fiscal year. So it's really like 1906, 1907. That's the peak to the United States. Before then, Italian migrants, they really started to move around actively, really in the 1880s and 1890s, and there were Italians that actually were choosing Brazil and Argentina before the United States, and for some policy reasons that I won't get into, they started to shift to the United States in particular. And most of us, even if we don't know the details, are somewhat familiar with this story. It was a period where in the United States, right, there were a lot of industrial jobs that Italians specifically, some were skilled at. We also had a lot of construction jobs that Italians filtered into, mining in particular out west, stone cutting, bricklaying, even artistic pursuits, right? Italians would be hired by Gilded to paint frescoes and in Gilded Age mansions. But one of the things that we know a lot less about is what I look at, which is the migration of Italians who were facilitated. So they were recruited, they had contracts signed, and they were delivered to cotton plantations primarily in the American South, or to become what was known as truck farmers, where they would raise fruit and vegetable crops to sell along the railroads to the industrial workers in the cities who needed, right, a ready food supply. But back in Italy, one of the reasons that so many Italians left, and there were, I think, about 2.3 million people left just in the first decade of the 20th century. We have statistics. The height in the United States, it was like about 250,000 to the height was, I think, 400,000 entered at that peak year that I mentioned. So this was the largest group. They were leaving because most of Italy at that time consisted of small land holdings. Farmers were essentially tenants. There was little opportunity for advancement. The economy had yet to really industrialize beyond the cities of the north, like Torino and Milan. Again, most people who are Italian American can trace their roots to the regions known as the Mezzogiorno, the regions below Rome, and in the south. So that is where the country was overpopulated. And opportunities were few. I mentioned the threat of political suppression, though, and I think it's important for this podcast and the listeners in particular, that some of the people who left were socialists and anarchists. And these were people who the Italian government, when Italy unified between 1861 and 1871, were violently suppressed by the army. So especially in Sicily, sometimes some of the migrants were actually part of these radical cells who left. And there's historians who've written some great books about that, and great books about the labor press and the radical labor press, like in the United States. Mm-hmm. We can see the record of what these people were writing and doing and agitating for. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Well, yeah, you gave me more than I expected, but I appreciate that. It's funny you mentioned the industrial workers of the world, which was pretty radical. Mm-hmm. And I mean, much of labor was very, very radical, very militant at that time because they needed to be. They had to make some serious changes there because workers were suppressed. What I found interesting in some of your talking points today is the importation of Italians, and especially in the southern part of the country. And as you know, Lauren, the southern part of the country is nothing like the northern part. And there was a civil war that was fought over that back in the 1860s. I'm not going to get into that. But when it comes to the southern states and the landowners there, was there a specific process where they said, hey, let's get some Italians to work for next to nothing, or maybe nothing?
Yes.
What do you say to that?
So you're taking me all the way back to my 25 years almost now, to when I first started to uncover this history, because it didn't make any sense, right? Like, why does a region that was really awash in tractable labor, right, where white elites had figured out after the Civil War how to retain their control over Black agricultural workers through law, through economy, through suppression of access to education. Why did they go out and go to this extreme, honestly, like all this work to send labor agents to Italy to recruit Italians on a contract and send them here to the United States and bring them to places like Arkansas, Louisiana, later on to North Carolina, to Mississippi. These are not easy places to get to in the late 19th, early 20th century. So one of the reasons that this facilitated immigration scheme began, and I use that phrase specifically because facilitated immigration was necessary. These Italians who migrated to the South, they didn't have resources to move on their own. And of course, this is also a story, right, of like labor mobility. How is it that people get to jobs? Or, how do they get stuck sometimes, right, in places where the conditions of work are poor or horrible? And that has a lot to do with resources at their disposal. So for these Italians in particular, there were a few plantation owners or agricultural reformers. I'm going to say that with a little bit of air quotes because they believed what they were doing, but of course they were deeply embedded in the politics and the economics of of Jim Crow South. But these guys collaborated with Italian diplomats who were of a class at the time. They were called the prominenti, like they were the people, not just running the government, but they were the educated class. They were so distinct in their mindset and experience from these migrants, really, that they thought that their role, the diplomats thought that their role here in the United States, consuls, ambassadors, and the Commission for Immigration in Rome, they thought their role was to protect Italian migrants, that they needed protection, especially from the crime and squalor and discrimination and violence that they faced in cities and in labor camps, like in railroad camps or in mining camps, where there were episodes where Italians were attacked, murdered, especially in the early 20th century. But the biggest incident was the 1891 lynching of 13 Italians in New Orleans, and that story launches the first chapter of my book. People are unfamiliar with that. So, I think the thing that ended up happening, right, is so you have this kind of intersection where you have some landowners that don't want to negotiate with Black labor. So they're like trying to do an end go around to Italians who they think are going to be better farmers. And they use all kinds of like this language of desirability and racist language to talk about how much better and well-suited Italians are, how much better workers they are on the farm. On their own personal farms. And they try to sell the land to Italians on mortgage. That never happens. But they collaborate with these diplomats who, again, want to send more Italians to rural America. They think they're better suited to go there. They think it will help solve what is becoming known as the problem of immigration. And a lot of the language at that time, even though it's about Italians and even though it's, antiquated, it doesn't sound that different from the conversations that we have today, right? About desirable and undesirable immigrants, desirable and undesirable labor.
Yeah. In this conversation, I have to ask the question. We're going to take a break here because I have a couple more questions. When will we ever get immigration straight in this country? Because we have a history of doing all the wrong things. Our featured guest of the show today is Lauren Braun-Strumfels. She is an associate professor of history at Cedar Crest College, which is in Allentown, Pennsylvania. We'll continue with Labor 131 right after this on America's Workforce. And don't forget, you can check us out on at least 5 platforms. That includes YouTube, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, Spotify, and Pandora. And when you get an opportunity, here's what you do. Just sign up and receive our shows on a regular basis and give us a rating. We always appreciate those 5-star ratings, so please keep them coming. Let's go back to our featured guest today. Again, this is part of our series, Labor 131. It's kind of a countdown to Labor Day. It'll actually wrap up on the Friday after Labor Day. And what we've been doing is going around the country finding some very interesting guests to talk about what happened in labor union history. And today it's Lauren Braun-Strumfels, who is an associate professor of history at Cedar Crest College. out in Allentown, Pennsylvania. We're talking about Italians involved in the labor movement going back to the 1880s, 1890s. She's written several books on what happened, the migration. That's why we saw this explosion of people, especially in Europe, coming over here. And what happened back then? I mean, there was a lot of animosity between the different ethnic origins. I want to talk about the Italians involved in unions, if you don't mind. Obviously, this is a 100% union show. And you talked about that struggle. You talked about recruiting, especially in areas where they get cheap labor in the South. But what about unions? And unions always struggle in the South, not so much in the North. But what about that shift and the involvement in unions to make a better life, not just for Italians, but for everybody?
Yes. So this is a great question. And I think it gets at some of the ways in which Italian radical history can be better lifted up and understood. So Italians, we see in particular a couple of the industries and the unions that Italians were really involved in and influential radical Italians, United Mine Workers, for instance, silk workers. The people, your listeners might be familiar with the Patterson silk strike in New Jersey. They were really instrumental in organizing and sustaining that significant strike. So we see Italians also in textiles. Some people might be familiar with the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, that tragedy. But what we know before, right, Triangle, and also what we see reflected, unfortunately, in the list of victims in that industrial disaster were absolutely essential presence of Italians in organizing, like the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, in the needle trades, and in some of those industries in particular. So when you turn to the kind of work that I do, looking at agricultural labor in the South, you kind of have two strikes against you, if you will, two difficulties in organizing, right? First of all, the rural component, which is one of many reasons why we see union organizing in the South at lower numbers and just less of a presence there. There's a lot of other reasons, but I'll just throw that. I'll just mention that. So we've got the rural component, and then the agricultural labor. I mean, there's a reason, right, why we see labor solidarity emerge in industrial workplaces, because you're putting people together who can now talk about what they're experiencing, their struggles. And industrialization was obviously a huge spark, right, to labor movement. And we think about, I think about like the women textile workers in Lowell, and just the radicalism of standing up and saying, I deserve better, I deserve a voice for myself, I deserve to speak, right, as as a worker, equal to the voice and the power of management of capital. That's a pretty incredible statement. And so I think, to bring it back to Italians, we see them as well. The people that I look at never had any, I think, any real opportunity there. When they organized, they would reach out through their ambassador and their consul, but they also confronted, like, one of the major challenges they confronted. So I mentioned they're, rural areas, isolated. They're in very small communities where there's not a lot of other Italian speakers. That challenges solidarity, but they get there because of Italian labor agents. So there's also like the co-ethnic angle to it as well. When we think about, oppression and kind of capital and labor's relationship, and like how co-ethnics became not just a major problem, but like the myth of the padrone, or the mostly like Italian, but also sometimes Greek, even Mexican labor agent who profited, who recruited people, and then stuck them in horrible conditions, prevented them from organizing, took their money. That myth, that image is really strongly associated with Italian labor also in this period.
If you don't mind, I want to talk about the railroads. And I'm
Yeah, yes. Please, okay, yes. I'm so glad you mentioned it because I went through a whole list.
I got you going. I can tell. I know your current book project, Between the
Yeah.
Lines, Railroads Facilitated Migration and the Business of Racial Capitalism in the New South. And we talk a lot about the rails here on the show. There's
Yeah.
like 12, there's 12 different, I think it's 12 different unions in rails. And we've featured many on the show. And there's a battle going on because these rails, the owners are making big money here, and they're just they're using all the technology that's available to cut down on the workforce, and they've done a pretty good job of doing just that. In fact, we just saw a recent merger, an attempted merger here between
Yes.
two of the largest railroads. It's I call it the race to the bottom because they like to run and these trains are like 4 miles long, and they want to go to like one person running them or maybe none at all. I mean, the automation, that's crazy. But if you can give us a little sneak peek into what you're working on here, because this is an issue that should concern a whole lot of people, if not everybody in America, when it comes to labor rights, union rights, and things like that.
Yeah. So my current book project is, as you mentioned, focuses on, in particular, so it looks at the issue of Italian migration, and it uses what's really the signature of my work, which is examining the history of the South through Italian diplomatic records, because they preserve a lot of what's otherwise been lost or purposely suppressed. So you were talking about, the business of railroads in particular, and one of the things that I'm looking at is the record of how these railroad magnates used their power, their political power, their economic power, to recruit Italians who would not just build track, but also who would buy the excess land that the railroads got the state and the federal government to grant them along their right of way. So after they built the road, they would sell these parcels off. And there were agents who did this as a job, who were very, like, they would travel around and they would print circulars and little advertorials about wonderful opportunities. We see this in the Midwest a lot, but it happened in the South too. And in that way, right, these railroad agents. So for years that I've been working in the archive in Rome, I found these railroad agents, and they were prolific, always writing the ambassador, trying to get Italian contracts, trying to sell lands on behalf of banks and other landowners. That's another part of the story, right? How capital connects so deeply. And I'll just throw in something, a little footnote, is that the people who I write about in my second book, which will come out, supposed to come out next fall from UNC Press. The people I write about in that book on the history of the immigration problem, they were trying to create these agricultural colonies with Italians as alternatives to Black labor. And how they paid for this work was through railroad investments, in some cases. So they were basically subsidizing this work through their investments in railroads. But to come back, to thinking about the railroads. So they had these labor agents, and the agents were, as I said, they're all over the archive, the records of the ambassador to Italy and the United States, and yet I thought, oh, okay, I'll go in the business records of the Southern Railway, for example, right, the first corporation in the South, or I'll go on the records, of other really key important railways. And I'll look for the directions that the president gave to these agents. Guess what? There's nothing there. There is no record there. And and I was like, I know what they were doing. Again, I have the Italian records. I know what they were doing. Well, what I've come to figure out is that these agents were operating on their own. They were so important and powerful that the railroad presidents did not want them to keep a record of what they were doing because it was illegal. So the U.S. record's been purposely destroyed or covered up. And I found one document from 1889 that testifies to the relationship between Sam Spencer, who founded the Southern Railway. He was J.P. Morgan's guy on railroads. When J.P. Morgan wanted to know what to invest in and what not to, he would call up Sam Spencer. There used to be a statue of him. I mean, it's still there in Atlanta. They moved it. He's an incredibly important guy. And so I found one letter between him and this railroad agent, a guy named M.V. or Milton Valentine Richards, who I've been tracing for years and years. And if anybody knows anything about M.V. Richards or you're related to him, please reach out to me. But I find this letter from 1889. So Spencer, before he organized the Southern, he was on the board of the Baltimore and Ohio. And these railroads at this time were constantly going bankrupt, getting gobbled up, consolidated. Farmers, this is one of the major political issues of the 1890s, right? Is that farmers wanted railroads regulated. They wanted their rates regulated. Safety was a major concern because the railroads were often in major industrial accidents. And that's actually how Sam Spencer dies in a railroad accident on his own road. But and historian Scott Hufford's written a really great book about this stuff. But what we see is like this sort of specter, this kind of fear of that both railroads were dangerous, not just to passengers, but they were dangerous also to the future of the country, to free labor democracy, because of their consolidation, because of their incredible power to influence politics. That's some of the other stuff I'm researching right now, these secret letters where they try to influence the governor's race in Georgia. And there's no questions about it. It's not, well, maybe. It's like, we're going to do this. So that's in the 1890s. The other thing that we see, right, with so this letter going back to Sam Spencer and M.V. Richards in Baltimore, he writes this letter in 1889 and he says, "Oh, Sam, I'm so sorry to hear he wasn't renewed to the board of directors of the B&O. I hope this doesn't interfere with the good work we've been doing." And that's it, right? Yeah. That's it. It's like, if I was a novelist, I couldn't have invented this letter, but I'm not a novelist, so I can't invent it, but I have it. And I go, oh my God. I spent an entire day, 8 hours, just searching through every single slip of paper in Sam Spencer's papers at University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Shout out to the librarians there. They're fabulous. And that was the one scrap of paper I found that documents the connection between the two. The one, but it cracked open this whole story. So, wow. Yeah. So stay tuned for more on that. I'm actually gonna write about that as I said, in the book I'm working on this year.
Well, I want to thank you for your time today because you've been very entertaining. I can tell you love doing the research. I mean, you just absolutely can't wait to do more. I'm not going to hold you up. I have to end this podcast. Lauren Braun-Strumfels, our featured guest today on behalf of Labor 131. She's an associate professor of history, Cedar Crest College, and I should drive everybody to the website just in case you have information for Lauren. And that would be laurenbraunstrumfels.com. Lauren Braun, Braun, Strumfels.com. Lauren, thank you so much for joining us. Keep up the great work that you're doing, and don't be a stranger. I'll tell you, we like to do this deep dive, and every once in a while, especially now as we kind of march to Labor Day. As far as I'm concerned, every day is Labor Day in this country, but that's another story. You take care, stay safe, stay strong, okay?
Thank you so much.